The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. The Gospel of the Lord. So last Sunday, I was pointing out the fact that people often get hung up on what seem like mysterious symbolism in the Bible. That especially happens when we read the book of Revelation, but the symbolism in the Gospel of John has also been a source of great wonder for biblical scholars for the last 2,000 years. And this is particularly the case with numbers. Do the numbers that John mentions have some deeper symbolic meaning? And so, from antiquity, biblical scholars have wondered about this pool of Bethzatha, or it's sometimes rendered as the pool of Bethesda. When you go there and you visit it, it actually says, "Welcome to Bethesda," so we feel really right at home. And he says that this pool has 5 porticos. And people have wondered, so what's with this number 5? Now, in Jesus' day, the pool of Bethzatha was a spring-fed pool of water, and it's very close to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It was a place where John says many sick people with incurable diseases hung out because of the belief that there were some healing properties in this spring. If you look at an annotated copy of the Bible, you'll see that verses 3b to 4, which are missing in your reading because they were a later edition, they explain the legend of an angel of God coming down and stirring up the waters, and the thought was that whoever stepped in first would get healed. But John also mentions that this pool has 5 porticos, which are like covered breezeways. And so for centuries, biblical scholars have debated the theological significance of that number 5. Why did he say 5? Does it represent the 5 wounds of Christ or something like this? And there actually is a lot of symbolism in John's gospel, and he says so. So many scholars believed that this number must have had some kind of special meaning. Towards the end of the 20th century, though, modern archaeological digs were conducted on the remains of the pool and the ruins of the massive Byzantine-era church which had stood on top of it. And archaeologists were able to discover that the number 5 signified that there were actually, literally, 5 porticos in that pool. It was a box bordered by 4 porticos. So there was one on each side in a box, and there was one that bisected the 2 of them. And that was very unusual in that day, and that's probably why John mentioned it. So if there's any symbolism here, it is that the guy whom Jesus encountered in today's gospel reading was literally sitting in a box. And he had been in that box a very long time. So, have you ever been told that you got to think outside the box or get outside the box? Thinking outside the box and getting outside the box means imagining possibilities that you had not imagined before. It means being willing to do things very differently than you're doing them right now. And it means ditching often a tried and true system which, even if it is not working for you, at least you understand. And that's why thinking and acting outside the box is easy to say, but not so easy to do. Yet it's actually what Jesus asked the man sitting by the pool of Bethzatha to do. He's asked to do something entirely different. And this man, like many others, figured that the pool was his only hope of moving forward in life. It was, quite literally, his box, his system, if you will. And so when Jesus comes along and asks the man if he wants to be made well, the man doesn't really answer the question. Did you notice this? He starts complaining to Jesus that the system hasn't worked for him. I try to get up, but somebody else steps down in front of me. He wants to get into the pool, but somebody always beats him to it. But Jesus didn't actually ask the man if he wanted to get into the pool. He asked him if he wanted to be made well. Yet the pool is the only system or the only box that this guy knows. And it was hard for him to think outside the box of the pool because the pool was a system he was familiar with, which he knew worked, or at least it had worked in the past. Clearly, somebody or some number of people had become better because of getting into this pool of water. And, since it was a thermally fed spring, it was probably nice, warm, bubbly water. And hey, I feel better when I sit in the hot tub too. So probably it did have some healing properties. It was hard for this guy to think outside the box of the pool because he was tired, frustrated, and angry that the box had not worked for him. He tried to find others to help, but he hadn't been able. Maybe Jesus would. In any event, sometimes you get so emotionally caught up in how badly things have been going for you and how the system hasn't worked for you that you can't even focus. And that seems to be happening with this guy. And maybe he was having trouble thinking outside the box because even though he knew the box wasn't working for him, it was the only box he knew. And he just couldn't envision any other action he could take. After all, he had apparently been unable to walk for years, so what else could he do? But as Jesus begins to have the conversation with this guy, he invites him to think outside the box of the pool. And in this case, that means Jesus invites this man to see an opportunity instead of just a crisis. Because for many people, that's the first hurdle to thinking outside the box. We get so obsessed with the crises in our lives and the world around us that we can't see the possibility of an opportunity. Indeed, this guy seems caught up in his own personal crisis as he complains that he can't get into the water. But he doesn't tell Jesus to go away. And so perhaps on some level, he's at least receptive to listening and considering another way. And often, that's the first step in getting outside the box. For this guy, too, part of the way that he started to think outside the box was to focus on the goal of the pool rather than the pool itself. Jesus asked the man if he wants to be healed. That is, he invites him to remember that the goal really is about being healed, not getting into the pool. And sometimes thinking outside the box begins with focusing on the goal that you think you're being called to instead of just the vehicle that you think you need to get there. And Jesus also invites this guy to do something completely unimaginable. In fact, it's crazy. He says to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." I mean, the guy knew he couldn't do that, but he tried it anyway. And one of the reasons this story is considered a miracle is not just that Jesus could perform a miraculous healing, but that this guy was actually willing to try. I mean, would you really be willing to try that? I am not sure I would, but the miracle is that he did. And surely, because he did, he was willing to live into a different way and literally walk outside of the box. And the reason this story is read during the Easter season is to remind us that often the way of hope and new life is found by heeding God's call to think and act outside the box. Outside the boxes that we sometimes place ourselves in, outside the boxes that maybe we've created for ourselves and we don't see another way. After all, in Easter, at that first Easter, nobody expected that Jesus could die and rise again. It was completely unimaginable. Yet the resurrection was experienced by people who could see that God acts outside the box. And often, to begin experiencing the hope and new life of the resurrection in our daily lives, Jesus invites us also to think and live outside the boxes that we have been living in as well. But, thinking and living outside the box is frequently not any easier for us than it was for that guy who was sitting by the pool of Bethzatha. That's especially true when the boxes we're used to don't work anymore or work in the same way. And at that moment, it's important to listen for the opportunities God is giving us instead of simply focusing on the crises we face. Because too often we can get stuck in anger and frustration that the pool, whatever pool we're looking for, isn't working like it used to, instead of looking for a new way forward. And after all, many of the boxes in my life are boxes that I have constructed because at the time they worked. And I've been especially attentive to this as I have been setting up my new shop. I've been able to put stuff back into my garage, and I instinctively end up wanting to put stuff back in the same places that I had it before because that was the only place it would work before. And I'm sitting there going, I don't have to do that. That's such a small thing, but so hard to do. And sometimes what Jesus is inviting us to do is to consider, are we doing things because we have to do them in that way, or because we have told ourselves over the year this is the only way we can possibly do them? And to consider that maybe God is showing us a slightly different way. Part of what Jesus is calling us to do is also to focus on the goal instead of the vehicles that have brought us to the goals in the past. So what is the whole point of what we're doing? And over the years we do yard sale a little bit differently than we've done it in other years, because the goal is to try to help people. The goal is to try to recycle things, and people ask me why do we have yard sale? I said, because we don't throw anything out in this church, so we got to have yard sale to try. So if you left anything here and it's in lost and found, make sure you check that out, because we will yard sale it. That's the only way we get rid of stuff. But remember the goal, not just the vehicle that we use to get there. And I still remember this old story from years ago about Kodak, which I don't think is even still in business anymore, but they were a big camera company early on in the 1920s and 30s, and they got famous because it made it possible for people to take pictures. And that was the goal, make pictures. But by the time that I was in high school, mostly Kodak made film. And as things went digital, Kodak said, our goal is to make film instead of to take pictures. And that's how they got in trouble. Always focus on the goal that you're being called to, and not just the vehicle you think you need to get there. And part of what Jesus is calling us to do is to be willing to try a completely new way to reach the goals we believe God is leading us towards. And again, this begins with making sure we're not just looking for a new way back into the pool. And it's actually one of the reasons that the first reading today is part of this set of readings. We don't technically we don't sort of notice this, and with all the great funny words that Jennifer read very well of name places, Paul has a vision, and his vision is to go to a place they have never ever been before, Europe. It's the first story of the disciples of Jesus crossing essentially the Dardanelles Strait and going into Europe, going to a place that they have never been. It's really literally outside the box geographically. And sometimes, like in that story, or when Jesus says, hey, take up your mat and walk, we're being told exactly what to do. But often in our lives, we don't know exactly what Jesus is asking us to do. But Jesus' promise of new life and forgiveness is the call to listen and to try new things that may at first seem completely ridiculous, and even be willing to fail in order to find a way forward that God is giving us and move us out of the boxes we've been living in. Thinking and living outside the box is always challenging. And yet Jesus' promise of life and healing remains for all of us. And the goal of life is not to look for the magical pool, but to listen for the opportunities for hope and new life that Jesus is calling us towards. The goal of life is not to set our hope on any kind of pool, but to focus on the healing which Jesus offers. And the goal of life is not to find a way down into the past, but to look for and explore the new ways of standing up and living that Jesus promises lie ahead for all of us.